Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. Thank you so much for joining me once again on this much warmer week. Last week was frigid here in Ontario, and today is so much warmer. Still not really feeling like winter today, but a lot better than minus 36 degrees Celsius. So I will take it. So tonight I wanted to talk about feedback and how we give our students feedback and why we should give our students feedback and what that might look like in the classroom, and perhaps a few tips and strategies on how to effectively give feedback in ways that is going to meaningfully push your students to move forward in what it is that you want them to do. I personally find that feedback might be one of the best indicators of student success is when I can give students individualized feedback that pushes them forward. That is when I see probably the most progress and specific kind of individualized feedback. So I'm going to be talking about how to give feedback, why you should be giving feedback, and perhaps some strategies on how to give feedback in the very small time constraints that you might have, and some of my tips and tricks to save you some time along the way. If you are new, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Patty. I am the teacher blogger at madlylearning.com, and I come live every single Monday night at 9 p.m. to talk about all things teaching in our classrooms, especially when you are using inquiry-based learning strategies all throughout your teaching practice. And it is my hope that every week I can give you some different ideas about how you can push yourself to try different inquiry-based teaching strategies all throughout the curriculum so that you can make learning fun and engaging for your students, and also making it practical for you as the teacher in a way that doesn't make you want to necessarily pull your hair out. So I wanted to talk about feedback. And what made me want to talk about feedback tonight is I'm feeling refreshed after my report cards are almost finished, and we're starting to get back into our cycle. So we've kind of finished up a lot of assessment things, and now we're moving back into our regular learning scheduled programming. So that generally means that there's going to be a lot more feedback that's going to be involved between me and my students, because I do really like to give my students one-to-one feedback, especially when it comes to their writing or what they're doing in math or even in science and social studies. So I'm feeling as though this is happening in my classroom. So I wanted to share with you some of the ways that I do that. So I really look at there being a few different kinds of feedback that I can provide my students. So the first is whole group feedback, then you have small group feedback, you have one-to-one feedback, and peer feedback is also really important too, to give your students opportunities for that kind of feedback. And then a bonus would be self-assessment, because you really want your students to be thinking critically about how they can judge themselves and how they can push themselves forward so that they can begin to make their own goals and starting to achieve those. So those are my different kinds of feedback that I want to go over. But why do we need feedback? So I keep reflecting back on this cycle of assessment. And this is where we give our students our success criteria and our learning goals. And we have them develop goals that they want to achieve and how they're going to achieve those. And then they do the learning, and then we provide them feedback on how well they did, how well they met those success criteria and learning goals. And then they make new goals to where their next step is. So that is feedback kind of in a nutshell and where it fits in terms of the cycle of assessment. And for me, I find that it's feedback that gets my students to really push themselves forward in their learning and make the most gains is when I can give them valuable feedback. So some of the ways that I can do that is first whole group feedback. So if you imagine you're collecting your group of students, you're collecting all of their work. As you are marking and looking through their work, you're noticing that there is some commonalities or there's common errors that are happening with more than like 8 students. You've got more than 8 students, so you're feeling like you're constantly giving the same feedback over and over again. Well, instead of scheduling one-on-one feedback time, this might be something that I might decide that will structure one of my lessons in the future, and I will give whole group feedback. So we will look at what the task was, and I will maybe generate a sample that is a good example of what I'm seeing in student work. I may ask a student whether or not they are comfortable with me sharing something that they have done. And even if I'm picking a student where their example is a non-example. So for instance, it could be using capital letters properly. So I may use an example of students' work who is using capital letters appropriately and talk about what that means. I may pick a sentence out of a mentor text and take out all of the capital letters and talk about how to put that back in and what that looks like. But if I'm noticing that there is a common theme missing or some area that students are struggling with more than others as I'm going through their work, that will often take time to inform instruction, and I will have a specific lesson designed with me giving whole group feedback, explaining to my students what it is that I want them as a group to be focused on working on. Now, this is sometimes good, and it's also can be sometimes problematic, because if you have 15 students in your class where you're providing feedback to, and it's applicable to, say, 2/3 of your class, you still have that 1/3 where they're kind of wondering why it is you're giving them this feedback, or if it's you're talking to them. So sometimes you do need to have those one-on-one conversations with those students where perhaps they're on a special education plan or they're working on something different, and you need to reinforce that maybe that feedback isn't the most applicable to them, but you did need to do it whole group because you need to save yourself some time, because you can't constantly be having the same questions. Now, instead of whole group feedback, if you have a group of students that you can group them into like groups, you could do a guided lesson with students on specific skill that you're noticing. So if you have in math 5 students that are struggling with using a protractor and say 6 students who are struggling with geometric properties, or you've got another group of students that are struggling with distinguishing between, I'm just using geometry because it's what we're doing right now, but they're just having a hard time distinguishing between how they are sorting triangles, whether it's by side length or by angles. If they're having a hard time differentiating between those two different ways of sorting, then you can group your students based on need and then have a small group session where you're providing feedback, and be explicit and say to them, I'm pulling you into this guided group because I noticed that there was a common error in some of your work, so I just wanted to work through that. So let's work through that together. And then at the end of that session, you can say, okay, how are we doing with this? And have one of those reflective conversations with your students that asks them whether or not they have moved forward in their thinking, what they're still stuck on, what they need to work on next, and where they need to go. So looking at their work and deciding if there's common, enough of them having the same problem that it needs to be a whole group feedback instruction, or if it needs to be a small group lesson where there's a bunch of different things that I can kind of group together. Now, the reason I really like to call this, that just sounds sometimes like teaching, but I really try to focus during these feedback sessions in clearly identifying what my purpose is in that lesson. So I want to give the students an understanding. The reason we're doing this lesson is because I've been noticing in your work this is happening. Or the reason I want to do this is because I'm seeing that some of you are having a hard time with this. Now, even if that happens to be I'm seeing that a lot of you are struggling with folding paper. Let's have a conversation about organization and how to fold paper and correctly insert those into your notebooks so that your teacher might not lose her mind. True story. That was a lesson last week. So you have to look at what's going to move your students forward, whether it's a whole group or small group, but being really honest with your students as to why it is that you're having that conversation, why you're doing that lesson. You didn't just pull it out of the textbook. It's not just something you decided to do for no reason, that it's very much grounded in relating back to the success criteria that you have for the learning that you're doing in your room, because maybe you're working on editing and they need to really look at capital letters because that's where you're seeing a lot of the errors and you're just not seeing them picking it up when they're doing peer feedback on editing and they're doing their editing checklist. If they're not picking it up, that's a really good reason why you're having that, and making it very clear to your students that that's exactly why you've picked that lesson that day, because it's what you're noticing as being a common error for them. So that's whole group and small group. Now through those two, you're also modeling appropriate feedback language so that students will have that when they're giving peer feedback. So the one area that I really like giving feedback, and this is especially true in, say, science and social studies when they're doing inquiry projects and they might get stuck at a certain point and need to just talk it out with you through their learning. If they're finding research, they just need to check in with you to see if there's misconceptions, as well as with language where they are working through a piece of writing and they want to share it with you so that they know what it is specifically they as a writer need to work on moving forward. This is where I want to do one-on-one conferences with students. Now there's two probably big hiccups for this. One is time. Do we ever have enough time to meet with all of our students, especially when in junior we might have classes around 30 students? Finding time to individually meet with each student might be particularly difficult. So that comes down to using a few tips and strategies, and I can share with you what I use in my classroom to help speed up that process so that I can get through and see more students in a shorter amount of time while also providing the valuable feedback during those sessions. So I really do think that finding time to do one-on-one feedback with students is important. So some of the ways that I find are helpful is having a tracking page. So with language, when a student is done their writing, I have a form that they're required to fill out. Now, when they're filling out this form, it goes through their name, the title of their piece of writing, a quick summary about what their piece of writing is about, and then a section that tells me that they are what they thought they did well and what they think they need to work on. And the very bottom section of that has some lines for me to fill out our feedbacks, kind of to record our discussion about what it is that we're talking about. And at the very bottom, it says progressing with some difficulty, progressing with some success, progressing well, or progressing very well. And it's just 4 boxes at the bottom. When a student has done their writing, they hand in their writing to me with one of these feedback forms. So whenever students are done, they're just going to put their writing in the hand-in bin. So I will go through these one at a time, and I will read the student writing sometimes during my prep or after school, or sometimes if it's a shorter piece, I'll do it right there with the students. I will go over that piece of writing, and then we will talk about the success criteria that we have for their form of writing. And we'll reflect on how well they accomplished those success criteria. And a lot of it is a conversation between me and the student where I'm asking them what they think they did on their piece of writing and if there's evidence of that. And then I will tell them how I think that they did. The conversation that we have, I quickly make a note on the lines provided for students on what I think they did well, where their next step is, and then I check off on the bottom what it is that where they would be, whether it's progressing with difficulty, some success, well, or very well. And I just put a check mark and I sign my name. Now this form will eventually go home to parents so that they can be aware with where their child's writing is and what are some of the things that the student is working on in writing. So it helps communication as well with home when the students remember to take them home. Then they get their parents' signature. I find this feedback form really helpful for a number of ways. One, I find it difficult sometimes to track the feedback conversations that I have with students. I need a way to track them so that I can have a record of them. So having a form that students are responsible to fill out and then I just have the bottom section to fill out is helpful because it keeps me understanding what it is we're commenting on. The top half reminds me of what it is that my comment is related to. So that's kind of for me. So if I look back at the feedback form, it'll often jog my memory enough to know what piece of writing that student was referencing, or at least I can go find it in their Google Drive folder or in their writing book. So it's a quick, oh, right, that's the piece that we were talking about, this, and that. So that I find that helpful to have that quick little jot note. It's easy for me to track, and then those just go in their feedback duotangs. So I also will schedule students on a calendar. So although the students will finish when when they finish, they fill out this form. I also have a calendar that's posted behind my guided reading table where students will estimate when they feel as though their writing is going to be done, and they will sign up for a conferencing time. And I make a reasonable goal to try to conference with 2 or 3 students a day. So I'm not conferencing with 5, 6, 7 students, and I'm certainly not necessarily conferencing with students all the time. Now, some students are going to get more time than others, depending on what they're writing. My students that are well on track don't need to conference with me as frequently as some of my students that are progressing with some success. So the frequency in which they're conferencing is going to vary based on student need and how quickly and how frequently I need to check in with them and provide them more feedback. I have plenty of students that are right on track, so they don't need me to conference with them quite as much, unless it's me just saying, wow, this is a great job. Look at how well you did. Keep up the great work. This is maybe the next place you can try. But that's a very brief conversation. Kathy asked how I track these slips for my needs. So these go in their yellow. I put them in, they have yellow duotangs. So they put them in their yellow duotangs, and those sit in my classroom and they go home. Now, sometimes I will make a quick note in my own records that I did conference with them. So for instance, I conferenced today with a student. So I have a little tracking page with a box with all of their names in their own box. And I just write a code. So it has PW, the title, and then it was nonfiction. So I can go back and look at it. If they don't, sometimes I'll also just take a photo of them. I have a few students that aren't the most reliable at bringing those pages back and forth from home to school. So for those friends, I will often take a photo of their feedback form so that I can keep track of it. I've also in the past done feedback forms digitally with students so that I have a tracking of that. This group of students that I had this year, we definitely need a paper trail for them. Digitally was just, it's too much and it wasn't as effective using digital feedback. But for my own purposes, I will make a little note on a class list about where they were, but the feedback form stays in our classroom except for when it goes home to get signed and returned. And then they just keep them all in their binder and then in their duotang, and they're required to then share them with me when they hand in their final draft. And if they don't, they have to redo it again and re-conference again. So I've had a few that have had to re-conference with me because they've lost their form, and that's the process that we've gone through. So that's for some of them. But yes, photos for your students that struggle the most with executive functioning. Take photos of their work. If you've got an iPad or a phone with you, just quickly snap a photo of them. Evernote's really good to snap a photo, or even Google Keep if you use that, because you can search it. So that's very handy. With social studies, and when I'm conferencing with students on social studies, I will often go through the success criteria and just quickly check that there's no misconceptions. Sometimes I'll check in with them, how well you're going, show me what you've got so far. And it's simply just a roving feedback conference. So I will walk around and I will just check in with students. How are you doing? Where are you? Show me what you've got done. What about this? And it's just a lot of questioning and probing with them. It's less of a formal feedback loop where you've got students conferencing with me on a piece of paper in a more formal thing that's scheduled. With social studies and science, I will very much conference with them in a much more informal setting. And then I will again track it on a student list where I can just make a quick note of what it is they're conferencing. Or I'll also use Edocio where I can quickly just put icons in a class list and select, green star, blue star, yellow star. And I know what that means for my own purposes. So I try to check in with them and push them to do something different. So they just completed work on habitats, and some of them did videos. So they would show me their videos, and then I would watch them and say, oh, do you have this part? Are you missing this? How could you what could you say about this point on our success criteria? Could you add more information about that? And then I would quickly just make a note, sometimes at the end of the day, sometimes kind of while I'm walking around, if you've got a little clipboard, or just quickly in my iPad, were some of the different ways that I kept track of those. And the last kind of feedback is student and peer feedback. Once your students have a lot of experience, one of the things I really like to be able to do is get students to offer feedback to one another. Now, before they often do this, I think that it's important that they give feedback to, say, a student sample in a moderating activity. Having these reflective conversations with your students is really important. You want to make sure that you are telling your students why it is that you are relating the lessons they're learning back to why it is that you're teaching it. You haven't just randomly picked the things that you're doing. There's a purpose for why you've decided today we're going to talk about adding ing to the end of a word, or that we're going to talk about capital letters, or why we're going to talk about a certain aspect of science or social studies. You really want your students to be aware of the purpose of your learning in the classroom, and that you've taken that because you've noticed that there's a need for it. And being able to embed these lessons every once in a while so that your students you're able to be responsive to what it is that they're showing you they need, and then telling them that that's why you're doing it and that you're looking for it and how it relates back to that success criteria that you have in your classroom, so that you can fully go through that cycle of assessment where you are giving them the learning goals and success criteria. They're doing an activity, and then you can provide them the feedback, and then they can make a new goal so that they can accomplish and do something more to make sure that they get and they can accomplish those learning goals and success criteria that you set out at the beginning of the learning. So if you want to learn more about giving feedback, you can check out the blog post on www.madlylearning.com, which will be posted and updated later this week. And if you are interested in learning more about inquiry-based learning, if you hop on over to madlylearning.com, you can sign up for my Inquiry 101 course, which is free for you. Just enter your email and I will send you 6 learning modules on how to get started with inquiry in your classroom, and kind of laying the groundwork and foundation for using more inquiry-based strategies in your classroom, including tips and tricks and a bunch of free resources that go along with it. So you can find Inquiry 101 over on my website at www.madlylearning.com. And don't forget that this live video is also rebroadcasted into a podcast on iTunes, as well as put over on YouTube. And again, it's on my website there, and it's always live here on my Facebook page. Thank you so much again for joining me, and I will see you next Monday at 9 p.m. as we talk more about teaching with inquiry. Thanks so much. Bye for now.